Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Alan Ware, and I'm the Global Coordinator of Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and also the Program Director for the World Federalist Movement, two of the co-sponsors of this event, along with People for Nuclear Disarmament and the Human Survival Project from Australia. And as you know, because you've registered for this event, it is about Australia and the Doomsday Clock, opportunities and initiatives that middle power countries like Australia can take to prevent nuclear war and work for nuclear disarmament, including through no first use policies. So thank you very much for joining us today. Also with me co-moderating is Jade Didier, who I'll pass over to in a minute, but just a little bit more about the webinar today. So what we have is we've got a conversation here with former policymakers, some current parliamentarians and experts on the issue. It's also the webinar is held in conjunction with the UN International Day of Sport for Peace and Development. And there are some connections between the ideas of sport, of having differences but resolving them peacefully, of building a cooperation, and the idea of peace and disarmament. Now, we won't stretch that too far. We're really, like looking at what is the current political climate and what's needed and what can, as I said, what middle power countries like Australia can do. So again, thank you all very much for coming on. We will have some presentations and then some time for question and answer, and we'll guide you through that as we go. So I'm now going to pass to my co-moderator, Jade Didier, who will introduce herself and just say a little bit about this event. Jade?
Yeah, hello everyone. So my name is Jade, and as Aline told you, I'm the co-moderator of this event today. I'm working with the PNND here in Prague as a student in international relations, and I'm very honored to be here and to bring a bit of my help for the good flow of today's conversation, which is, I think, very important, not to say very necessary, given the sensitive times in which we are living. So I think it's also very important for the youth to be implicated in those kind of discussions and to understand what kind of future we are preparing all together. So thank you, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here, and I pass over to you, Haline.
Thank you very much. So I have the honour and privilege of introducing our first speaker, who's the Honourable Gareth Evans, who's a former Foreign Minister of Australia. And he's also been the convener or co-convener of a couple of really important commissions on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. Firstly, the Canberra Commission on Nuclear Disarmament, and secondly, the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. Through both of which explore deeply the issues surrounding nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament issues, and where there are opportunities to advance disarmament and nuclear risk reduction. Also, he is the founder of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network, which is a mix of current and former policy officials, defense officials, foreign ministry officials, parliamentarians, are in the Asia Pacific in order to build some dialogue and cooperation in the region on these issues. And that also has a similar one over in Europe, the European Leadership Network. So it's wonderful to have you here, Gareth. Gareth is going to give a keynote, so he'll have a little bit more time to explore what is the political environment at the moment and how best can we navigate that and actually have some impact. So Gareth, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Alan, for a very generous introduction. It's a real pleasure to be joining you all in this enterprise today. Well, the Doomsday Clock really says it all. The move in January of the hands of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Doomsday Clock to 85 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been, really is a wake-up call which none of us can ignore. Along with global warming and pandemics, the other existential risk to life on this planet as we know it, the risk of nuclear war, whether triggered by deliberate aggressive first use or probably more likely through accident, system error, human error, cyber sabotage, human idiocy. That risk is really now as great or greater as it's been since the height of the Cold War. And the sad reality is that while nuclear arms control has never been more necessary, it's never been more difficult to achieve. In all three of its dimensions, risk reduction, non-proliferation, and outright elimination. In all of these areas, the outlook, I have to say, ranges from desolate at the moment to hopeless. The important arms control agreements of the past are dead, dying, or on life support. And the recent behaviour of the actors that matter most, the United States, Russia, and China, has fed concerns that really things can only get worse. The question for today's discussion is what, if anything, can we in Australia do about this very deeply distressing state of affairs? I think we have to frankly acknowledge from the outset that on big global issues, there's only so much change that can realistically be accomplished by even the most creative and energetic of middle powers, as Australia has periodically been over the decades. Any influence that we wield has to rely on diplomatic persuasion, coalition building, not on the exercise clearly of raw military or economic might. But we have made significant contributions in the past to nuclear arms control, as well as to other weapons of mass destruction issues, like bringing to a conclusion the Chemical Weapons Convention in 1993. And I believe that we can again, even in an environment as dispiriting as the one we now confront. Our past achievements on the nuclear weapons front include the Keating government's initiation in 1996 of the Canberra Commission on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, the first international blue ribbon panel, including political, economic, military, and environmental leaders and experts from all around the world. It was the first such commission to argue effectively for global zero and has been much quoted in the international debate ever since. There was the lead advocacy role we played. I was the lead advocate for Australia as Attorney General at the time in the ICG Advisory Opinions case in 1996 on the legality of nuclear weapons. There was the crucial role played by the Australian Ambassador for Disarmament, Richard Butler at the time, in securing in 1995 under the Labor government the permanent extension of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and in 1996, under the coalition government, I cheerfully acknowledge, the adoption by the United Nations of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the CTBT. There was the initiation by the Rudd government in 2007 of the joint Australia-Japan International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, which not only made a strong case for an ultimate elimination agenda, but did map a realistic step-by-step risk reduction path for actually getting there. There was the co-founding in 2010 of the Cross-Regional Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Initiative, NPDI, to take forward consensus outcomes, such as they were, of the NPT review conference process. And Australia finally has also been among global leaders in developing, through the International Atomic Energy Agency and other mechanisms, effective safeguards, nuclear security, and test monitoring strategies, including, as we did, concluding in 1997, the world's first IEA Safeguards Additional Protocol. When it comes to advancing the cause for nuclear disarmament, probably the best we can do in the present environment is to make supportive statements at ministerial and diplomatic level, at the UN and elsewhere, spilling out and not looking anxiously over our shoulder at Washington in the process, that whatever deterrent utility nuclear weapons may conceivably have had in the past, the risk of their continued possession by anyone in today's fragile, multiplayer, and increasingly cyber-driven nuclear world, that risk really far outweighs any conceivable benefit from their possession. If taking that stance means that we can no longer rely in a crisis on United States extended nuclear deterrence, as distinct from extended conventional deterrence, I think that simply acknowledges what's always been realistically the case, that the United States would never contemplate sacrificing San Francisco for Sydney, let alone Miami for Melbourne. As to whether we should put our money where our mouth is when it comes to signing the Nuclear Ban Treaty, the TPNW, Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, Some of the concerns which have so far inhibited Australia from doing that have really no substance at all, and I frankly acknowledge that. The treaty does not undermine the NPT, its non-universality, and its various technical weaknesses, which are real, are not in themselves showstoppers. We could work from inside to rectify those deficiencies and to promote its wider acceptance because it is a very significant normative step forward. But the problem that Australia does face here is that the Nuclear Ban Treaty quite specifically prohibits any form of assistance whatever to any nuclear weapons related activity. And this really would make it, in practice, impossible for Australia to continue to jointly host, in particular, the US early warning, the so-called joint, but the US early warning intelligence gathering and targeting facility at Pine Gap in Central Australia. And that would in turn be very much a showstopper for the alliance. Of course, with Trump's America acting ever more crazily and treating its allies and partners ever more contemptuously, it is getting harder and harder to argue that the benefits of that alliance continue to outweigh its risks. But I have to say that tearing it up now would be really rather a lot to bite off at the price of joining a treaty which really practical teeth as much as we might love it normatively. And I can't really imagine any government on either side of politics in Australia for the foreseeable future going down that particular path. When it comes to supporting nuclear non-proliferation, the commitment of successive Australian governments to the NPT and to strengthening its regime in every way possible, including through universal adoption of the additional protocols on inspections, that's always been very clear and very unequivocal. And of course, that should obviously continue to be the case. There is an argument with which you'll all be familiar that AUKUS, nuclear fuel-propelled submarines, that project is at odds with our non-proliferation commitment. But I frankly think that while the other arguments for ending this wildly, wholly misconceived project are really quite overwhelming, including arguments about deliverability, cost effectiveness, and particularly loss of sovereign agency involved in the enterprise, I have to say that the proliferation potential of the AUKUS agreement is not something that really troubles me or that really does make a case for winding it up, because the new safeguards protocols that are presently being quite painfully negotiated at the IAEA in Vienna, I think should put to rest any such concerns about its proliferation potential. On the non-proliferation front, we should also maintain in Australia our commitment to the CTBT, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organisation implementation, to the currently stalled fissile material cut-off treaty negotiation, and our commitment to the kind of nuclear security measures which were recommended by the successive Obama-initiated nuclear security summits. We should emphasise, of course, in all relevant forums, our traditional support for nuclear weapon-free zones and lend our weight to the concept, I think very important concept, of a Northeast Asia nuclear weapons-free zone, which would embrace Japan, South Korea and North Korea, and perhaps also Mongolia, with accompanying guarantees from the United States, China and Russia. Hugely difficult, of course, as this will be, to implement, recognising that the task now with North Korea is really not one any longer of non-proliferation, but actual disarmament. What we should not do is respond to potential breakouts from the NPT with the illegal and irresponsible use of military force. To the extent that there remains an Iranian nuclear threat, something about which I have to say I've always been quite sceptical, and I'm happy to elaborate on that if we get to that in question time. We have surely learned by now that it's only through cooperative diplomacy of the kind that we saw in 2015, bringing to fruition the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Settlement, that can end that potential risk threat. It's not United States or Israeli bombs that can do that particular job. When it comes to supporting nuclear risk reduction, our status, for now anyway, as a close United States ally, and as such with the states, should give Australia a significant role. In the Trumpian world that we now inhabit, where allies, let's face it, are more likely to be seen as encumbrances rather than assets, there may not be much room left for influence, but that should not stop us trying. My highest priority of all in all of this, and this brings me really to the central theme of this webinar, would be to support the struggling but still growing international movement for the universal adoption of no first use doctrine by all the nuclear armed states. It should not be a matter of pride for Australia. President Obama and President Biden were attracted to going down that particular path, as they certainly personally were, and made that clear, or at least sole purpose, functional equivalent of no first use. It's no matter for pride for us. Australia was one of those nervous Asia Pacific and East European allies who completely failed to support Obama and Biden in that enterprise. But the failure to make progress there not be seen as the end of the argument. One of the many, very many peculiarities of the administration is that the president does seem to have a visceral distaste for nuclear weapons and some understanding of the risks associated with their possession and use. And it may conceivably be that in this particular enterprise, we would in fact be pushing at a more open door than might at first seem plausible. The arguments for no first use are really very strong. There'll always be those, of course, who argue that for any nuclear armed state and any state believing that its own security depends on a nuclear protector, that a credible deterrence posture demands the credible threat of nuclear first use that not be ruled out. But I remain wholly convinced that retaining a first use option, as most of the nuclear armed states clearly still do, is extremely dangerous, both for wider global peace and security, and often for those states' own interests. And I personally very strongly believe, as I've said, that advancing no first use should be Australia's highest nuclear arms control priority. Why is it dangerous to retain a first use option? Well, I think there are four reasons, and I can very succinctly spell them out. First of all, a nuclear armed state that keeps a first strike option runs the risk of an adversary misreading its intentions and, fearing decapitation, launching a preemptive strike, precipitating an otherwise wholly avoidable nuclear war. Secondly, a nuclear armed state that fears a surprise first use attack from another, which has kept open that option, is much more likely to keep a significant amount of its forces on extreme launch alert, thereby, here trigger alert, thereby increasing the risk of human or system error or miscalculation causing a launch that precipitates the very catastrophe that it's supposed to be trying to avert. Thirdly, refusing to adopt no first use, I believe, certainly encourages vertical nuclear proliferation within countries' own nuclear stockpiles, because it incentivizes potential adversaries to upgrade their own nuclear forces to deny their opponents a first use advantage or to gain one themselves, thus fostering nuclear arms races with all the multiplication of risk that such arms races necessarily involve. And fourthly and finally, it's dangerous, I think, because of the potentially significant contribution that adopting or refusing to adopt rather a no first use policy can produce to horizontal proliferation. Because when a state with any kind of conventional capability insists that it needs nuclear weapons to deter or to defeat non-nuclear attacks, it necessarily concedes that right to any other country fearing or claiming to fear such an attack. There's one final, before I conclude, there's just one final Australian initiative that I'd very much like to see happen, and that would be for Prime Minister Albanese to make a major speech comprehensively drawing together the key threads of the nuclear arms control story. That is commitment to the goal of a nuclear weapons-free world, to nuclear non-proliferation, and to nuclear risk reduction, and explaining how Australia realistically can contribute to each of those objectives. Anthony Albanese and his government are not given to making big visionary conceptual statements, as we'd all rather noticed, but this would be a good opportunity to break out. It's long been my very strong belief that being seen to be a good international citizen, a decent country, committed to purposes beyond ourselves, is a national interest in its own right. To be pursued just not as a moral imperative, not just to some kind of optional extra, but for hard-headed projection of soft power, for reputational benefit reasons, and pursued with the same commitment that we show to the traditional duo of national interests that everybody always talks about, security interests and economic and prosperity interests. There can be no more obvious demonstration, no more obvious way of demonstrating our decency as a good international citizen than by making a very clear declaration at the highest political level of our absolute determination to contribute to ridding the world once and for all of the horror of these most indiscriminately inhumane weapons ever invented, and the only weapons posing an existential threat to life on this planet as we know it. So there we are. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you, and I look forward to participating in the rest of the discussion.
Honourable Gareth Evans, thank you so much for laying out a picture of what is the political environment with regards to nuclear weapons policies. But importantly, where are the opportunities for middle power countries like Australia to act, and looking at that with both idealism and realism, mixing the two. It's not to give up, but nor is it to be oblivious to what are the political realities. And I think that is really important. That helps guide. Already you've started to stimulate some conversation in the chat, which is very good. What I'll just mention, though, to participants is some of your comments in the chat are sort of in the forms of questions. So if you'd like some of the panelists to come back and answer them, then put them into the Q&A box. We do have one question in the Q&A box. We're tending to come to most of the Q&A at the end of all of the speakers, with one slight exception, and that is that Zali Steggall is going to have to leave at 5. So just after her presentation, we might field, if there are any questions to her, we might field 1 or 2 questions. But then some of these other ones which are coming up will open up to all of the panelists in the Q&A session. So we are watching the chat box. We will also try and pull some of the questions out of that when we come to the Q&A session. So again, thank you very much, Gareth. And I'll now pass over to Jade, who's going to introduce Senator Shoebridge. Jade?
Yeah, so our next speaker brings a vital parliamentary perspective to this discussion. Senator David Shoebridge is a member of the Australian Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. As a member of the Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, so the PNND, he is at the forefront of translating the imperative of nuclear risk reduction into the practical language of legislation and national security policy. So thank you very much for being there. And I pass over to you now, Senator David Shoebridge.
Oh, we appear to have lost him. He's left. So apologies about that. He was here and then he just dropped out. So, Jade, are you able to instead now introduce Zali Steggall and also the International Day of Sport for Peace and Development? Apologies for that. He only just dropped off.
Yeah, it's no problem. I wanted then now to bring a bit of light on the International Day for Sport, for Development and Peace, which was actually yesterday, but we are commemorating it today. This is a day that emphasizes sports as a vital tool actually for youth mental wellness, community cohesion, but also breaking down social, cultural, or generational barriers. I'm sure we are all sharing the idea that sport is about the feeling of unity that we all felt, whether being like spectator or being a participant. And this day is about this. This day is about everyone being involved, fostering inclusion, creating safe spaces for dialogue and solidarity, which I think definitely resonates with the discussion we are having today here and what we want to push for. But I think our next speaker, Madame Zali Steggall, will speak even better about this. Indeed, as a member of the Australian House of Representatives, she's a powerful advocate on issues ranging from climate action to sport integrity. So she also serves as co-chair of the Parliamentary Friends of Climate Action, and her presence here highlights a critical point. Nuclear risk is not a niche issue. It intersects with climate, security, and governance. As an Olympian and parliamentarian, she brings a unique perspective on discipline, resilience, and the need for clear, principled leadership. So over to you, Madame Zak.
Merci, Jade. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you. What a fantastic discussion, while sobering. I think these are always very difficult topics. If I may start by paying my respects to traditional elders and custodians of the land on which I'm coming here in Warringah in Australia, but I know many of you are in many other lands, obviously, then we're all online. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans and obviously Senator David Shoebridge when he comes on, and Alan and John of the Parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. It's really important to keep having such strong advocates for such an important issue. I think we are living through a moment of extraordinary nuclear risk, and it's not about being alarmist, it's about being realist. As you said in your introduction, I actually got into politics very much focused on climate change as one of our biggest existential threat, but there is no doubt that it sits alongside nuclear armament being the other major one. It is interesting. We are, of course, like you said, meeting on the International Day of Sport for Development and Peace, which was yesterday. It's a United Nations International Day that recognises sport as a tool for development, inclusion and peace. As a four-time Winter Olympian and a member of the Court of Arbitration for Sport, I strongly agree that that is a role that sport can play. It can bring everyone together in terms of inclusion and looking for peace. Sometimes I think it needs more proactive work than what currently probably happens. But look, yesterday it's a day that highlights how sport can support human rights, health, education, gender equality, and social cohesion. So it is important that sport can bring people together across cultural, political, and social divides. In a more and more divided world, it's important that we remain having those areas where we can do it. So more broadly, the day is a day to remember that sport's not just entertainment, but it is also, it can contribute to peace building and positive social change. So it is an incredibly important and powerful platform. But we have to make sure sport is not used, from a gaslighting point of view of washing out sort of, things that are not consistent with those principles. And that's where inclusion at major Olympic and sporting events of athletes of certain nations becomes problematic. Of course, in the topic today, January 2026, the Doomsday Clock moved to 85 seconds to midnight. So that's the closest it's ever been to catastrophe. And look, it's hard sometimes to stay positive between that and obviously predictions about how we're tracking on climate change and global warming. We are approaching a lot of very significant existential threats. Now, in relation to the Doomsday Clock, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists pointed to worsening great power rivalry, conflict involving nuclear armed states, the collapse of arms control guardrails, and the growing role of AI in military systems. I think we can all agree they are really concerning, and the world seems to have lost its guardrails at the moment. Now, Australia, we are as a middle power, we have a role to play. We are not, I would say, overtly influential, but we are a respected middle nation in the world, and so we have an important role to play and voice. And yet we haven't made good. Successive Australian governments have not made good on the opportunity and position. Australia has not signed or ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and I would argue there's no excuse for this. We have a responsibility. And now we, and especially at the moment, we're meeting during an ongoing conflict with the US and Israel and Iran. And there's continues to be the conflict in Ukraine with the attack and invasion by Russia. And these are nuclear states that hold great power. Now, obviously, in relation to the war in Iran, the justification that was given, there's no doubt that a world where Iran does not have nuclear weapons is a good thing. But we have to be mindful. Operation Midnight Hammer in June last year, in 2025, that was supposed to have knocked out Iranian nuclear capabilities. Now, yet we seem to have had the same reason justify the attack and the war that we're currently seeing unfold in the Middle East. Now, obviously, so we seem to be back where we started a little bit, with a conflict motivated by the logic of nuclear brickmanship, of justifying it. Now, under the Obama administration, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal, had collapsed in 2018 after the US withdrew, and its restrictions expired. And since its breakdown, there's no doubt Iran has increased uranium enrichment, reduced international inspection access, and raised fears it was moving closer to a nuclear weapons capability. Hence, the pretense that the US under Trump and Israel have used to start the war in Iran. Now, in that environment, it's really important, this policy of a no first use approach. It really matters. It's a simple principle. Nuclear weapons must never be used first in a conflict. That would not, because of course it would not solve everything overnight, but it would reduce the risk of panic and miscalculation and catastrophic escalation of a conflict if you had that commitment of no first use. And of course, we need policy solutions beyond no first use. In the context of the upcoming Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty review, we've got to keep pushing for de-alerting and better military-to-military communication as a starting point, especially in the context of conflicts that are occurring now with a US that is very unpredictable and volatile. When we look at the actions of the Trump administration, whether it's Venezuela, threats around Greenland, whether it's the support, conditional support around Ukraine, and obviously now the war in Iran. In terms of what we can do here, I've long believed that Australia should do more than just speak out in generalities. In 2019, as a new Member of Parliament, I argued Australia should push to reduce global warhead numbers and work to reduce the roughly 2,000 weapons that are currently on high alert. So that policy of de-alerting and better military-to-military communication becomes all the more important when you think of those at least 2,000 weapons on high alerts. So that remains true now, and I'd say even more urgent under the volatility that we're seeing around global geopolitics. And I guess from a personal perspective, I have visited Hiroshima, and I don't think any person, I actually think all members of parliaments of all governments should be mandatory to go and visit the Hiroshima nuclear memorials. Because of just to truly understand and take in the level of devastation and civilian costs that is paid with the use of such weapons. And look, of course, the nuclear danger is very much here, and I think people are very uncomfortable at the moment with the volatility between the US, the actions of Russia, and great powers gaining strength. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute warned in 2025 that there was a dangerous new nuclear arms race occurring. and it's emerging with 9 nuclear-armed states modernising or expanding their arsenals. So instead of going in the right direction, we're actually accelerated in the wrong direction. So at the same time, the last major bilateral arms control limits between the US and Russia, New START, it expired in February this year, in February 2026, and we really didn't see much of that because of all other events. Now, the upcoming Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference running in May in New York will matter enormously. We know it remains the cornerstone of global non-proliferation regime, but its credibility is going to depend on whether nuclear-armed states are seen to be reducing risk and moving, however imperfectly, towards disarmament rather than normalising the permanent nuclear brinkmanships. And of course, when you hear the US president make the kind of threats he's currently making to civilian infrastructure in Iran, it raises that degree of alarm, which is incredibly worrying at the moment. I think Australia, successive governments have said they are committed to a world without nuclear weapons. I welcome that, but I think actions speak louder than words, and that is when ratification becomes important of the treaty. So I do welcome the Albanese government's decision to attend meetings of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as an observer, but let's get real, being an observer is not a position of leadership, and I think it's time Australia took a stronger position. In 2022, I've written as an independent member of Parliament, written to the government back then and again, so previous government and now Labor government again, for us to take a stronger stance on nuclear disarmament. I think there are many people here that have better expertise than me in terms of understanding that the danger, the level of danger, and just why the action is so important. The de-alerting is really important at this period of global instability and I'd say volatility of major powers, in particular the US. That is really important. De-alerting, of course, means taking nuclear weapons off hair trigger launch readiness so they can't be fired within minutes, creates time for, I think, cool heads to prevail in a crisis, time to verify, time to communicate, time to think. And that's, again, why military-to-military communication, again, matters a lot. Hotlines, direct deconfliction lines, advanced notification, reliable crisis channels between military and political leadership is incredibly important. Again, in light of recent events, I don't know how much that is occurring, and that is concerning. They're not the big actions that I know many people want to hear, but they are incredibly important in de-escalating. And lastly, I think the risk of AI-enabled decision systems has to be omnipresent, and we have to be aware of it. I don't think governments are even remotely front-footed enough in having guardrails around AI use and how it is permeating every aspect of decision-making and of our lives. And so, ensuring we have the necessary safeguards is incredibly important. Australia still has a moratorium on nuclear energy, and I think that plays a good part because that does limit the amount of uranium Australia contributes to the world, and that is ultimately a good thing. I've been on a parliamentary inquiry in that respect and certainly did not support lifting the moratorium because we don't need more uranium available for processing. So ultimately, I think the Australian government, this current government, has taken some welcome steps, but it's not enough. I think it should go to the 2026 NPT review conference, pushing for practical risk reduction measures, including stronger support for the NoFirstUse, de-alerting and transparency on nuclear doctrines, stronger crisis communication arrangements between nuclear-armed states. I think the good news is Australia, I was in Parliament, we had the address by President Mark Carney from Canada. We've had, I think middle powers are working better together in this current environment, and nuclear non-proliferation should be part of those discussions. And Australia should move beyond symbolic engagement with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Obviously, the Pacific and the Southeast Asian neighbours have already joined it, so for us to be consistent with our region, we should be ratifying it as well. We can't just be observers. I think we have to be active participants in a more peaceful world. We're not powerless in the face of nuclear risk, but we do need political courage. As Gareth raised, I'm not sure that is a conviction of current leadership, but I think the policy of no first use is one of the clearest, most practical steps available to reduce the chance of catastrophe. And then de-alerting provides time. Communication reduces miscalculation. Of course, stronger diplomacy rebuilds guardrails, and I think we are at a time where more guardrails are needed, and we need that commitment to disarmament and restore that moral coherence. It's not a small task, but I think the more voices there are like here, the more hope I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zali, and it's really wonderful to have members in Parliament who are taking a really active involvement in this, looking at the issues that are important, and questioning the government to see what more, governments like Australia can do. So you're picking up, I think, on the challenge that Gareth put to us, is that, there are things that middle power countries can do. Good to hear that the Canadian Prime Minister spoke, because his speech at Davos, the World Economic Forum, was about that, about middle power countries working together to protect international law, protect the international institutions, and work for risk reduction in a whole range of areas. Nuclear weapons is just one of them. And I think you're mentioning the intersection of some of those. So thank you so much. That's really, really important. We're really, really blessed to have you in Parliament. I'll now pass on to, there's no specific questions for you, Zali. So a lot of them are more to the panel as such, and we'll wait until the end so that we can answer them together. Because I know you do have to leave in about 10 minutes. But anyway, I'll pass on to Jade now, who will introduce our next speaker, Senator Shoebridge. Thank you very much, Zali.
Yeah, thank you very much, Haleen. And yeah, I want you to welcome our next speaker now, who will bring a vital parliamentary perspective to the discussion. Senator David Shoebridge is a member of the Australian Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. As a member of the Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, he is at the forefront of translating the imperative of nuclear risk reduction into the practical language of legislation and national security policy. So thank you very much for being here. We are very honored, and I pass over to you now, Ms. Shoebridge.
Thanks very much, Jade, and thanks everyone for pulling this together. It's like a critical discussion point, and as I think a number of the speakers have already made clear, the world's in a bit of a mess at the moment. Trying to think about how to take some steps back from the brink and work out a pathway back from the mess, I think, is absolutely critical. I mean, I think I'm not the only one who wakes up in the morning and wonders what new nonsense dangers await us as on this little planet that we all share. So I'd like to start by acknowledging I'm on Gadigal land here. And we sometimes run past that acknowledgement, but First Nations peoples have a lot to tell us about how to live in complex societies without endless war, and leaning into working with our First Nations peoples across the country would be a very useful contribution in this debate. I would say an essential contribution. So this land is First Nations land. I don't want to reiterate what other speakers have said, and Gareth's very, erudite and clear commencement to this, all that mapping out where the world is at the moment and all these pressure and danger points is very clear. We have an ongoing war in Ukraine, stretching beyond its 5th year. We have a new cataclysmic war in the Middle East, threatening global food supply, threatening economic stability across the region, and at the same time causing appalling deaths in Iran and Lebanon. And that those two conflicts at either end of them are two of what used to be the two superpowers in the world, and now two superpowers in a more multipolar world, but Russia in one hand and the United States on the other, sort of driving global chaos from two ends of the spectrum. So what does a middle power do in a situation like this? Well, I suppose one of the first things we do is we think about what principles we want to be advancing in the world. What are our foundational principles for international relations? What's the world we want to be achieving? Now, you don't do that in some kind of abstract way of, distancing yourself from the reality of the world. We have to deal with the world as we find it. But I think, first of all, we should work out what our goals are. Personally, and my party's view from the Greens party is that we should be advocating for a world of peace and non-violence as best we can. And we should be advocating for multilateral collective arrangements to try and deliver on a world of peace and non-violence. What's the one that comes to mind immediately if we're talking about nuclear weapons? Well, this extraordinary achievement, which is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Australia had such a critical role in developing and establishing that treaty in the first place. And I want to pay credit to all of those Australians, some of whom received the Nobel Prize for their extraordinary work in establishing that treaty. And, when they were commencing those discussions around, lounge rooms and community centres and meeting halls in Australia, people said that's not possible. How could you possibly have a treaty to prevent nuclear weapons? Which countries would sign that? It turns out it's bloody well possible. And there are now, last time I checked, over 75 signatories to that and growing. Countries in our region, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, have all signed and ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's Labor Party platform to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But now they've been in government in their second term of government and they've failed to act. So I suppose we ask ourselves, why have they failed to act? Well, the reason they've failed to act is because the Labor Party, the Coalition, One Nation, those parties in the federal parliament are all absolutely rusted on to us having our existing relationship, however you describe it, with the United States. That is the simple reason why Australia has not signed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That's it. And the reason being that Australia permits the United States to bring nuclear weapons into our country and have them being able to be launched and directed from our country. Now that involves a deliberate policy of don't ask, don't tell about B-52 bombers that are nuclear capable coming into RAAF Tyndall in the Northern Territory. And when we ask the government about, well, why won't they prohibit nuclear weapons coming to Tyndall on B-52 bombers? It's consistent with the Treaty of Rarotonga, which is a nuclear-free zone in the Pacific. It's consistent, you would have thought, with our position of not having nuclear weapons. We get told that it's outrageous that we politicise that. How dare we politicise the US alliance? And there's a long-standing policy of don't ask, don't tell about US nuclear weapons on B-52s at RAAF Tyndall. It's now become an even bigger problem because the US has indicated that they will be putting nuclear-armed Tomahawk missiles on their Virginia-class nuclear attack submarines. And Australia is in the middle of building the United States an $8 billion nuclear submarine base for them just off Perth in HMAS Sterling on Garden Island off Perth. So US nuclear-armed submarines off Perth, US nuclear-armed B-52s in the Northern Territory, and our government is complicit in that and complicit in a global, the US global military deployment of nuclear weapons. We should have no part in that. We're not just neutral in this space. We're actually not not signing the treaty because we don't want to confront the United States and say, I'm sorry, you can't bring nuclear weapons into the country. Malcolm Fraser, when he was Prime Minister, he had a clear policy of prohibiting the United States from bringing nuclear weapons into the country. Now, if Malcolm Fraser can do it, why can't Anthony Albanese? And the reason is, I think, just fear of the United States, fear of us confronting them, and fear of maybe that would unravel AUKUS, which I think would be a good thing. But that fear is, and that complicity with US nuclear, the nuclear weapons of the United States is why we're not doing what I think we should do as a global citizen. We also have, we're a key part of US nuclear warfighting in Pine Gap, which is critical for targeting information, also for conventional wars like in Iran. If the doomsday message to end the world is ever sent to submerged US ballistic missile submarines, which contain hundreds of nuclear warheads, it's likely we'll be the handmaidens of that message because it'll go through Northwest Cape, which is one of the principal US bases for communicating with their submerged nuclear submarine fleet. Like, the message to end the world will be relayed and directed through Northwest Cape, just outside of Exmouth in WA. So, how do we step away from that? Well, I think now is certainly and absolutely the time to not only review but fundamentally change our relationship with the United States, to step away from their nuclear military, to, I would say, close US bases here, to not be part of the US nuclear umbrella. It's hardly an umbrella, as Gareth pointed out, that's going to protect us. They're not going to trade Miami for Melbourne or San Diego for Sydney. We know that. It's not really a protection for us. And as we're finding out in the Gulf, actually having US bases makes you a target. It doesn't keep you safe. It's not a protective umbrella. It's actually an attraction for trouble. And we should be absolutely advocating right now for the US to get rid of its ambiguity in terms of nuclear weapons use and have a very clear, unambiguous statement of no first use. I mean, our major ally has a deliberately ambiguous policy position, reserving the ability to use nuclear weapons, to be the first to use nuclear weapons, even responding to a non-nuclear threat. And I don't know about you, but thinking that Donald Trump is in charge of a military in a war that's going not well, potentially, costing billions and billions. The idea that there's no clear policy from the United States that would prevent the first use of nuclear weapons by the United States at a moment like this, I think it's deeply troubling for the world. And we should be absolutely advocating, yes, for the abolition of nuclear weapons, but also for a comprehensive international agreement on no first use. And can I just finish on a couple of other little points? Australia is also part of the problem in terms of tearing down some of the international architecture that has been used to control nuclear first use. One of the critical treaties that was developed during the Cold War was a prohibition or a moratorium on intermediate range missiles, which are particularly destabilising because there's a very short decision timeframe in which to make a decision about an intermediate nuclear weapon. The United States pulled out. When that treaty expired, the United States indicated that they would no longer be bound by it as against Russia. And then Australia worked with the United States and continues to work with the United States to develop a new class of missile, a missile launcher called Typhoon, which has been launched from Australia, jointly developed with Australia, and indeed the launching and development of that missile was one of the reasons Russia then used to say it would also no longer be bound by the intermediate missile moratorium. We're part of the problem in that regard, and I think we should be very clear about it. And the other factor I think that we should be really conscious of in a no first use space, and why it's absolutely critical, is the development of hypersonic missiles. Russia, China already have hypersonic missiles. Australia is actively working with the United States to develop hypersonic missiles. Hypersonic missiles are deeply destabilizing weapons. They are absolutely reducing the time frame within which critical decisions are made. And as Zali said, You link that with AI decision-making, rapid AI decision-making without a human in the loop, and maybe a 15-minute window or a 25-minute window in which to make these decisions because you have potential nuclear weapons on hypersonic missiles, you can just see how destabilizing it is. And far from Australia working to try and maybe create some new steps to show restraint and ban the development of hypersonic missiles, we're jumping in boots and all to develop them with the United States as well. And I think that does the world a great disservice. There is so much we could do to be a model citizen, but it turns out being a model citizen in this space also is the way of doing everything you possibly can to ensure your continued existence in the face of these appalling weapons that could destroy everything we love in just a matter of minutes. So yeah, thanks very much. I think there's lots to chew on.
Thank you very much, Senator Shoebridge, for bringing light on the ongoing conflicts today, which should not be forgotten, but also especially for asserting what can be done for our future by Australia, by other middle powers. I think that even if it might be complicated today, you recognize that we need to stay optimistic because otherwise we give up the word to violence, destruction, or big powers like the US. And I think this is not the future we want. I can tell that your comments are definitely very inspiring for the next generation because I'm part of it. And I think it inspires us to just take action to see what actions are actually possible by uniting and also pushing for concrete ideas and principles, and this on a daily basis that we are doing here today. So yeah, thank you very much again. I pass over to you, Aline, to introduce our next speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jade. Thank you, Senator Shoebridge. Thank you also to participants for putting questions in the Q&A box and also in the chat. There's a little bit of discussion going in the chat. That's all good as long as you keep listening to the speakers. It's all very good to be sharing some information, ideas. So thank you. We will be coming around to your questions very soon. We've just got 2 more speakers and then we'll be picking up the questions we can. Our next speaker is not from Australia, but it's really important because while we're talking about no first use policies and what Australia can do, we're also looking out into the wider stage and how these might be picked up, how they may be employed. And Dr. Manpreet Sethi is from India, which has a no first use policy. So it's very good to have someone, who has been following this, looking at what role that plays. Dr. Sethi is a distinguished fellow at the Centre for Air Power Studies in New Delhi. She's also a senior research advisor for the Asia Pacific Leadership Network. She lectures at the National Defence College and other establishments. She's also a member of the advisory board for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and she's on one of these international advisory committees set up by the Japanese Prime Minister of eminent persons looking to how to work towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. And I think like in her work, she's balancing again the nuclear risk reduction, nuclear war prevention aspects, also with disarmament. And she was a co-chair of the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan Working Group for a world free of nuclear weapons and violence, I think was the name of it. So quite a mix here. I think Dr. Sethi is going to focus a little bit more on no first use, but may relate it also to the broader goal of nuclear disarmament. Dr. Sethi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you, John, for this privilege of participating in this very timely webinar exploring Australia's role in preventing nuclear war. While one could well wonder, what could Australia, a country that has no nuclear weapons of its own and not even a nuclear energy program, do about preventing nuclear war? But I think the times currently are so tense and the shadow of nuclear war looms so large that all countries that have influence and a concern about nuclear issues should invest in finding ways of nuclear risk reduction and prevention of nuclear war. And as Gareth has already said, Australia has been a frontrunner on many of these issues in the past. This webinar is also focused on examining the role of no first use strategies as a risk reduction measure. I'm thankful that you brought me in from India, a country that has committed itself to this doctrine since it went nuclear in 1998. Despite the changes in its regional security environment, with Pakistan's move to full spectrum deterrence, including through projection of tactical nuclear weapons use, and China's rapidly expanding nuclear warhead numbers, other capabilities as well that could enable first strike, India has not wavered. In fact, the country has just commissioned its third SSBN, reinforcing the focus on survivability as one of the ways of exhibiting its commitment to no first use. For those no first use skeptics, and I saw several, a lot of chatter in the chat box. So there are several skeptics of no first use who dismiss it as a meaningless declaratory strategy. I've always maintained that the seriousness of a nation's commitment to no first use lies in its force structure. In the case of India, the emphasis has not been on warhead numbers, but on building a triad for ensuring survivability and on a force posture that remains relaxed, with the arsenal lying in not just a de-alerted, but a demated state as well. So in the little time that I have, I want to focus on three aspects. One, highlight the desirability of no first use in the current times of rising nuclear risks, and I will explain this through the example of India. Secondly, expose the dilemmas and the futility of first use, because till we understand what is that first use is really not a credible strategy, we will not give it up. And thirdly, explore some ideas on how to promote no first use. So first, why is no first use desirable now than ever before? I think the answer lies in the state of contemporary nuclear order, and several of us have already, mentioned where we are. Some of the settled norms appear unsettled once again. And two of these, I think, have particular relevance for no first use. The first, of course, is the norm of non-use of nuclear weapons. 80 years since the last nuclear use in Nagasaki, the taboo today appears more fragile, I think, for two reasons. One, there is a growing acceptability of use of force in interstate relations, something that we were not ready to accept for a very long period of time. But today, we've seen, and particularly last year, we saw three conflicts simultaneously play out between Russia, Ukraine, US, Israel, and Iran, and India, Pakistan. Each of them had at least one, if not two, nuclear players. The threat of nuclear use was made in each case as a deterrent. Also at display were risky brinksmanship strategies. To add to the concerns is the growing popularity of the idea of limited local nuclear war. Limited nuclear war is something we had stopped talking about. There was nothing like a limited nuclear war, but it seems to have become in news once again. The belief that a low-yield nuclear weapon can ensure limited damage and that there can be controlled nuclear escalation is a thought that has military appeal. But a precedent set by the opening of the door to nuclear weapons use could have far-reaching implications. So the idea needs to be nipped in the bud. Australia must galvanize other like-minded nations to make noise about the absolute non-acceptability of breaking of the norm of non-use of nuclear weapons. And this can be done if we have no first use. The second norm under stress is that of non-proliferation. Given how universal the NPT today is, the threat of horizontal proliferation should really be a non-issue. Any country that today goes nuclear will be the non-nuclear weapon state of the NPT. But the growing flaunting of nuclear weapons by the possessors, including against non-nuclear states, is resulting in a rethink of the value of nuclear weapons for national security. And this again needs to be nipped. Another possibility of nuclear use, as Gareth pointed out earlier, is through inadvertent escalation, owing to accident or miscalculation, growing capabilities of cyber attacks, blurring of lines between conventional and nuclear missiles, command and control structures, induction of dual-use hypersonic missiles, incorporation of AI in nuclear decision support systems. While we all seem to agree human in the loop for nuclear decision-making, but the support systems that go into nuclear command and control are using more and more of AI. And all of this is being done ostensibly to enhance deterrence. For instance, dual-use capabilities are meant to complicate the adversary's decision-making. Hypersonic missiles are meant to defeat missile defenses. AI is meant to accelerate decision-making. But the downside of these developments is that they raise instability in crisis situations when each adversary is bound to believe the worst and act accordingly. So the risks of nuclear use due to misperception or miscalculation are significantly heightened. And this can come down if countries were to accept no first use as a principle. At present, none of the nuclear dyads seem inclined to address these threats. In fact, there does not even appear to be a common understanding of the risks that we are facing, because some countries tend to believe that risks are good, that they enhance deterrence. So there is no shared understanding of risk at this time. And given this reality, measures that reduce the chances of inadvertent escalation are important. NFU could be one step in that direction. If every country was to commit not to be the first to use, there would be no nuclear use, and such commitments would be helpful in the wake of the emerging developments on which none of us has a handle yet. Now, it's obvious that nations are currently unwilling to give up their nuclear arsenals. We've all spoken and seen the mention of TPNW. But the rejection of TPNW by all of the nuclear armed states and many of the allies of the US demonstrates the mood that we are in today. In this situation, to my mind, NFU offers a big advantage. It does not require immediate surrender of nuclear arsenals because countries want to hang on to their nuclear arsenals, but let countries retain their stockpiles while committing not to use them first. This allows them then to maintain the notional sense of security that they're getting from their nuclear weapons, but it reduces risk and it devalues the weapon. According to my understanding, and to answer one of the questions also that appeared in the Q&A, TPNW, I think, has delegitimized the weapon without devaluing the weapon. What the TPNW managed to do was, instead of just denigrating the nuclear weapons, it started denigrating the possessors of the state, which has made possessors of the weapon, which has made dialogue and conversation between these two groups so difficult. A global no first use would encourage non-proliferation of both the horizontal and vertical variety. Why would countries want to acquire a non-usable weapon? And why would nuclear weapon states want to modernize a non-usable arsenal? Rather, as the weapon falls into disuse, they would lose salience and hence become dispensable, adding momentum to their move towards eventual elimination. The question now is how to get nuclear possessors to agree to no first use, especially when 7 of them seem to believe that first use deters better. But do they? The cases of ongoing conflict have shown not much benefit with the threat of first use. Rather, in Russia, it suffered several losses, and yet it has not used tactical nuclear weapons. The same was the case with Pakistan. One must recognize that a first-use strategies bring several dilemmas. Amongst the questions a first user must answer is when would it be the right time to use the weapon in conflict? Early or late? Where would you target as a first user? Counter force, counter value, or both? And how do you guarantee that there is no retaliation after the first strike? There are no easy answers to these, especially when the other side has a robust retaliatory capability. And you would also need to build an arsenal of first strike weapons, such as accurate missiles, real-time navigational aids to ensure high precision, MIRVed missiles to carry out multiple hits, extremely sophisticated ISR for real-time information, elaborate delegated command and control to enable simultaneous attacks. So you get a gist of how costly and how elaborate this investment needs to be, coming with no guarantee that you will be able to attain your military objectives despite the first use. You all might remember President Kennedy at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis had said, if I'm not going to be able to save myself from the incoming retaliatory strikes, it's one hell of an alternative that you're giving me to use my nuclear weapon first. And while, people think that it's liberating to be able to use nuclear weapons first, put yourself in the shoes of a political leader and try to make that decision on when it would be the right time for you to use the nuclear weapon, bringing back retaliation on yourself. So the credibility of first use of nuclear weapons is seriously in question. Lastly, just a minute on who could be the possible actors in mobilizing action towards no first use. In the current state of relationships between major powers, it's impossible to think that they would do anything jointly to address nuclear risks. China, for instance, had floated the idea of a global no first use, which no one has taken seriously amongst the nuclear weapon states. The most likely actors in this space will need to be the middle powers. especially those that are under the nuclear umbrella. And that's why it's so important that Australia has taken this forward. For them to stand would mean altering their own thinking about no first use. And ironically, this might be easier in today's times when the behavior of President Trump has cast a shadow on extended deterrence. If these nations want to continue to enjoy the gains of non-proliferation, they must push for no first use to devalue the weapons. I think lastly, mobilizing action could be through civil society in its widest possible form. Mobilization to create pressures on governments, a systematic and coordinated campaign that involves the use of all forms of media, influential and credible voices, and well-researched, convincing publications on the subject is one way of doing that. Movies such as A House of Dynamite and what we are doing today as part of this exercise is all part of this effort to make NFU and bring it back on the table. Thanks so much, Alan.
Thank you very much, Manpreet. And a couple of the things I took from your presentation, which to me is really important, is how no first use can be part of strengthening the norm of non-use. And I think you broaden the question out. It's like the norm of non-use is the most important thing to strengthen. No first use is not the only thing, but it is actually important. And I think it's putting in that context, it's very important. Later on, we'll also come to one of the questions, but not right now. But I think this sort of opens the door to that question is, is no first use, does it do that? Does it actually strengthen the norm, or does it actually open up the can of worms of retaliatory use? But I'm going to save that until we come to the question and answer times. But I think that's a really important question that people are asking in the chat and in the Q&A, because I think most of the people on here would agree with you that strengthening the norm of non-use is so important. And I know Gareth also talked earlier about the International Court of Justice case on the illegality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, which was an important part of consolidating a norm of non-use. Is that still relevant when these big powers are walking away from international law? We'll come to that as well. So yeah, these questions are popping up. But just before we get on to the questions, we have one more speaker. That's John Hallam, who's already been a little bit busy responding to some of the comments in the chat. John is one of the co-founders of No First Use Global, which is a coalition of organizations working to explore and advance no first use policies as strengthening the norm of non-use and working towards nuclear disarmament. John's also with People for Nuclear Disarmament in Australia, the Human Survival Project, and he's also representative of Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament to help engage parliamentarians in these issues. So John, you've got a few reflecting points to come up.
Well, yes. I mean, first, I'm deeply impressed by what every single presenter has put forward. And in a sense, I almost don't need to say anything because it's already been said. However, it is good to kind of reflect on, well, why did we put this webinar together? And really it came from two things. One was the need to broaden the discussion beyond just the TPNW, because there are, in fact, a wide range of things, some of which Zali talked about and which Gareth talked about, that help to, and of course Manpreet, that help to lower nuclear risk. Secondly, that this is a moment of extreme nuclear risk where we're at 85 seconds to midnight. There is absolutely not, maybe we're sort of bumping along the bottom. I don't know whether the risk is sort of greater this week than it was last week. I used to put myself into absolute agonies wondering whether the risk was greater this week, but I'm literally bumping along the bottom a very deep abyss. And the need for something to be done without being overly dogmatic about exactly what it is. And of course, no first use pops up as an obvious low-hanging fruit. And it's almost as if we are saying to the government, look, you've squibbed at the TPNW, surely you can at least do no first use. Surely you can take an initiative of some kind that helps to take the world back from the brink. And this is something I feel absolutely in my bones. If perhaps something could go up in the Senate along the lines of the NPT review conference is coming up in less than 3 weeks, in 2 and a bit weeks. Can something happen that is of a helpful nature and that comes from this government? And that is almost my my bottom line. So we needed to take the discussion beyond the ban treaty onto the wider range of no first use, de-alerting, mill-to-mill communication, etc., etc. All of those small, technical sounding, mind-glazing at times measures that are needed to make an accidental apocalypse less likely. And I think I'll leave it at that point. Something needs to come out of this government. My challenge to Penny Wong is bring forth something that is positive, practical, useful, and that helps to take the planet back from the brink, particularly in the context of the UN conference, the review conference that is coming up in 2 and a little bit weeks' time, and which of course I'll be at, along with Alan and others.
Great. Thank you very much, John. I'm actually going to ask the first question, and then Jade will ask the second question of the panelists. We might have time for one more. We've got about just under 15 minutes left. And then just to let you know that when we come to close this webinar, we're going to keep the webinar open for another 5 minutes in the end for those who want to stay on to do the white card for peace action. We'll do a white card for peace, take a photo of that for those who want to stay on for the International Day of Sport for Peace and Development. So the first question, I'm going to combine two, and it's to all of the panelists. Gareth was asked specifically for one of them, but it doesn't matter, it's for everyone. And that is to do with how could both no first use and the broader norm of non-use be advanced in the international institutions and mechanisms. Firstly, the NPT review conference, which is coming up, but broader than that. It's not the only place. And of course, some countries like India and Pakistan, Israel aren't even at the NPT review conference. What about the UN General Assembly? Are there other opportunities? How can this norm of non-use and the value of no first use, or the proposals for no first use, be taken up in these international mechanisms? Maybe I'll go to Gareth first. Gareth, you need to unmute yourself.
Obviously, it's crucial that we identify ways of operationalising this, and I think the key to moving forward on no first use is to engage those middle powers who are currently living under what they believe to be the protection of the nuclear states. The biggest letdown in getting a big advance on the no first use front was the failure to pick up the lead that Biden and Obama were both offering, that they wanted to go down that path, but the key East Asian allies and partners, the key European allies and partners, just squibbed it at the last minute. And I think had the United States embraced no first use, as the leadership then clearly wanted to do, that would have been something which would have given enormous momentum to the case for the others to embrace it. I mean, Manpreet has brilliantly articulated all the reasons why it makes so much sense, and how it does in fact interrelate with what we all hope to be the serious normative acceptance of complete non-use. I mean, no first use is not a matter of saying use is acceptable, but it's an important contribution to making sure that we never get to that particular point. One more point needs to be made about, and the vehicles for using this middle power cooperative capability is not only in direct representations to the United States and the other players where they're relevant and have an immediate line of access, or used to anyway before Trump. It's also in the context, obviously, of the NPT and in the context of the other gatherings of the UNGA, the relevant committees and so on. In every one of those contexts, it's crucial that this coordinated voice be assembled, and John and all the rest of them have got better ideas about, and you've got better ideas than I have currently about the way to actually do that. But the key to it is to somehow get engaged those middle powers that are currently thinking of themselves as part of the nuclear umbrellas. Just one more point about no first use. I think obviously people say, well, it's just a statement after all, and the doctrinal commitment is a commitment that could be reversed in a millisecond if the state chooses to do so. It is critical, if you are going to be seriously credible in making a no first use commitment, that you do the other stuff that so many of the speakers, David Shoebridge and Zali, were emphasised, and that is the de-alerting enterprise. It's the reduced deployment enterprise. You keep a retaliatory capability, but you don't overdo it. You keep your hands off your hair trigger alert risk factor, and you, of course, take seriously the idea of reducing your numbers or not adding to your numbers. If you do all those things, you do add real credibility to a doctrinal commitment. And without those additional measures, yes, there are issues of credibility involved. So it is very important when we're talking about a nuclear risk reduction agenda that we don't put all our eggs just in the NFU basket, but we do also advance those other parallel strategies which are critical importance in giving it credibility.
Thanks, Gareth. The same question to Manpreet. A lot of eyes are on the NPT review conference coming up, but the question is broader than that. And, are there also opportunities coming up this year at the General Assembly? What about the International Day for the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons? Is that an opportunity? Are there other opportunities to take forward the norm of non-use and no first use?
You're absolutely right, Alan. Actually, there's so much spilt milk here that we need to mop it where we can. So use every forum that can bring this up and bring it before the people. It should remain in your face all the time. And that's where slowly it'll start eroding some of the entrenched thinking that we have about first use being the only strategy that deters better. So yes, the NPT review conference, if we could get the P5 to do something on it, brilliant. I don't expect it in this NPT RefCon. I hope this one just survives and we move on to the next one, hopefully in better times. The conference on disarmament, where you do have India, Pakistan, North Korea, that is one of the forums where it could be done. UNGA, you already mentioned. I have also been proposing the idea of a nuclear risk reduction summit, much like the nuclear security summits, where leaders came together to think about these issues, to get them sensitized to what are these concerns, and perhaps in a forum like that, a no first use commitment as a gift basket by regions, by countries, could be one of the way. So whether it's unilateral statements, whether it's bilateral, I mean, China, India, both of us have no first use agreements, no first use declarations. Why couldn't we turn it into a bilateral agreement? Now, there are several problems that are in the way, but if India and China were to come together and have a bilateral agreement, that's another way of galvanizing action on this. And then, of course, there are these multilateral institutions that we spoke about. So it's not going to be easy, but we have to start building that momentum to make it a universal no first use.
Thank you so much, Manpreet. And just continue in that vein, if we don't put all eggs in one basket, it's not all the NPT, that's important, but we've got these other possibilities. Quickly to Senator Shoebridge, what about like some of the international parliamentary forums, the Interparliamentary Union? Are there ways that parliamentarians can build momentum globally?
Well, I think they are a possible tool. I mean, they haven't proven to be incredibly effective in the last decade or so as the world's been sort of spinning out. But I think ensuring there's communication between parliamentarians who share values, I think, is absolutely important. But I suppose I'd come back to what Australia can actually do. And one of the problems we bring to the table, and one of the reasons why we don't have the kind of impact, is our continued adherence to belief in the US nuclear umbrella as somehow keeping us safe. it has been demonstrated. It's been demonstrated right now that the US umbrella, whether it's conventional or nuclear, is not keeping people safe. It's actually the scale of that military enterprise and the way in which it's been used is making the world much less safe. And we should be taking active steps to distance ourselves from what decades and decades of doctrine of saying that a nuclear umbrella keeps you safe. It clearly is not keeping us safe. And that is part of delegitimizing nuclear weapons and delegitimizing the existence of nuclear weapons, even in this concept of them being a defensive weapon. You know, and I've said before what concrete steps we could take in that. We could say to the US, well, actually, you can't station your nuclear weapons. You can't bring them into our country. You can't cycle them through our air bases. You can't bring them through our airspace. And we should be taking ourselves away from that. But I think, you know, in moments of crisis, there are potentially incredible opportunities. And I think us recognizing, seeing the world for what it is right now, and the world is less safe because of the nature of the US military and the way it's been used. We should not pretend it's keeping us safe. And if Australia starts distancing ourselves from that and delegitimizing the existence of nuclear weapons, I think that would actually be incredibly useful. And the world would see it. The world would actually see us do that. And I think that would be a powerful statement.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question. Jade's going to ask it. But if you want to add any more comments, because we're near the end, feel free to expand a little bit on the question Jade's going to ask. But Jade, you've got a question there.
Yeah, exactly. I have a last question that actually came back several times in the chat box, and I will invite the speakers to feel free to just take over and answer this question, which is, does no first use legitimize retaliatory use?
Well, it doesn't legitimize retaliatory use, but it's consistent with retaliatory use, and therefore it's consistent with the nuclear armed states' current belief that they have to hang on to nuclear weapons, but it reduces the context in which they, you know, would use those weapons. In an ideal universe, we want a world with no nuclear weapons at all, obviously. We want a world with no use, not just no first use. But it's a hell of a lot of an advance, and we ought to recognize it as such, to get to a world where nobody does actually, you know, use weapons first, and they rely for the deterrent comfort zone, the comfort blanket that nuclear weapons seem to give so many people. You just rely for that retaliatory role. And, you know, you don't have to have massive deployments. You don't have to have weapons in silos on hair trigger alert. You just have to have a handful of nuclear submarines with, you know, nuclear weapons much less readily knockable out to have a significant retaliatory capability. And that's the key to it. I mean, we need to marry our idealism with a degree of pragmatism and a degree of realism, which is why I take the position I do on the you know, the nuclear ban treaty, which I'm passionately in support of the normative story that that treaty tells. But it's just not realistically achievable at the moment, and it's far more sensible to be putting our practical advocacy eggs and our campaigning eggs in significant risk reduction activity, which is, you know, consistent with that larger objective, but and makes a hell of a contribution to getting there.
Jade, if I may just add, Gareth has brilliantly put this, and I completely endorse exactly what he said. Deterrence is based on the idea of retaliation. But if deterrence was to be practiced through the strategy of no first use, and if everybody was to commit to no first use, there would not be a first use. So there would not be retaliation, right? So, I mean, we have to see it in the long picture instead of just seeing it as legitimizing retaliation. Deterrence is what is retaliation all about.
Thank you. Thank you very much for answering this question from the chat. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Brendan has made it very clear. This isn't some abstract logic puzzle. It's about trying to make the world vastly safer. And a universal adoption of no first use would make the world significantly safer. And I'm all for that. Probably where I have a slight disagreement with Gareth is I think we can do that at the same time as we advocate and press for the signing and the global adoption as far as possible of the Treaty on the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons. I think that normative action, particularly at a time when so many norms are being ripped apart, actively devoting real energy, diplomatic, civil, NGO energy to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the same time, I think is really important. You can even make norms even in a messed up world like this. And I think doing them together is actually incredibly powerful. I'm not saying Gareth doesn't support it. I heard his comments about support it, but I actually think the effort for both is what I'm advocating for.
Look, I have to quickly come in on David here. I mean, you have just underestimated the downside risks to us in terms of embracing the TPNW, given that the very explicit language of the TPNW says thou shalt not assist in any way anyone to engage in any of the activities that are prohibited by this treaty. And the reality is it's not just B-52s, and I'm wholly in accordance with you there. It's not just painting further targets on our back with submarine bases in West Australia with nuclear submarines coming and going. But it is, and it's not just the, other things that you've identified. It is the logistic and intelligence support that we do get from the United States that would be completely thrown out the window if we went down this particular path of signing up to ratifying the TPNW. It's a hell of a big step to take. I'm closer than I've ever been in my entire public life to thinking that the US alliance is running out. It's passing its use by date. I mean, what we've been subjected to with Donald Trump's behaviour and American behaviour in recent years makes me think that Malcolm Fraser may well have been right, and I may well have been far too cautious about this. But it's a hell of a big step for any political leader in Australia to take, to go down that particular path, when the price of doing so would be to tear up the alliance. And just the very final point on this, let's recognise in that context that the ban treaty would not, even if it's normative, yes, and it's fantastic in its normative aspirations, but it's aspirational rather than operational. It doesn't do anything about verification. It doesn't do anything about enforcement. It does require those people signing up to it, nuclear armed states signing up to it, to accept a time-bound and irreversible elimination of their stockpiles, which they're just not going to do if they believe there's an absence of enforcement or verification mechanisms that will ensure that no rogue state hangs onto their weapons after they've got rid of theirs. You've got these really practical problems with the ban treaty, which its enthusiastic supporters, for all the normative charm of it, are simply not taking seriously enough as a practical reason why real-world political leaders, idealistic as they may be, as idealistic as I've always been, have to be sometimes just a teensy bit more pragmatic. So in the finest traditions of what we've always said about your party, David, do not make the best the enemy of the good. By insisting on the TPNW, don't underestimate the utility of these lesser measures that we've been spending so much time on here. And to your credit, you're not doing that. You're not doing that. You're saying it'd be wonderful if we had both, but let's get on with the no first use and the other risk reduction stuff. And good on you for that, and good on Zali for that, because that's exactly what I wanted to hear. So well done.
And Gareth, I would simply observe, look at the world at the moment. I don't think it's us that's tearing up the alliance with the United States. I think that's happening pretty much coming from the direction of Washington. I may want to take active steps in that regard, but for the moment, this alliance is being fundamentally reshaped at the moment, and
it's more fragile than it's ever been.
Well, I feel it feels more like a hostage relationship than alliance. But anyhow, that's probably a discussion for another day.
Yep. I think it is. Thank you.
We also have John wanting to weigh in on here. John, you've got your hand up.
I simply wanted to return some of the conversation back to a sort of a conceptual comparison of a pair of countries that both have first use policies and another pair of countries that both have no first use policies. In the case of the pair of countries that have first use policies, each one of the governments of those countries is going to be asking itself, what happens if my opponent fires first? And the same will be true on the other side. And this escalates and escalates the risk that somebody will preempt or try to the other. And the difference made by going from that situation to a no first use situation is bound to be of orders of magnitude of probability that nuke weapons ever get to be used. So yeah, again, don't downplay the usefulness of these risk reduction measures. They may be the difference between civilization as we know it, or more or less as we know it, continuing with a few little glitches from climate change and a few other little wrinkles like that, and a untimely end to everybody and everything.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Gareth, Senator Shoebridge, Manpreet, and also the fellow who had to leave. We are just a bit over time, and thank you for staying on a little bit. This is not the end of the conversation. This conversation is an important one to have, and we're going to continue it. So we do this in cooperation through the NoFirstUse global platform. I have put the link into the chat there. We have newsletter, we have blog articles, we're going to do events. We welcome you coming on and contributing to this as we're going on. This has been a focus very much on Australia, but there are similar sorts of discussions happening in some of the other allied countries on how to take forward the norm of non-use, nuclear risk reduction, the interaction of that with processes towards nuclear disarmament. And this has been a very, very rich discussion. So thank you very much for everyone who's contributing. Also, just to highlight again the importance of having experts, parliamentarians, and civil society activists coming into the room together, and some of different opinions so that we can share those opinions. I think that's also very rich. It's why we left the chat open to enable anyone to sort of put their opinion as well as information and links, because that conversation, again, is very, very important. So we'll wrap up this webinar now, but as I've mentioned, that anyone who wants to stay on for a few more minutes, we will then, all the participants, we will bring your camera on, and if you have either a piece of card or you can have an A4 piece of white paper that you just hold in half, we are going to do the white card for peace, which is for the International Day of Sport for Development and Peace. Again, this is not compulsory, voluntary. Anyone who wants to stay on can do it. Other than that, we'll thank those who have to leave now, and look forward to continue the conversation with you again in the future. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn the recording off now because this is the official end of the webinar. But as I said, anyone who stays on will bring you on camera now so that you can join in if you want to with the white card for peace. It'll take a couple of minutes for everybody to come on.